is just the thin end of the wedge, so that's only one thing to look at. More important to look at is the amount of strategic and direct investment which is taking place in Africa. So also portfolio investment in terms of just equity flows into Africa, and all of that has been very strong. What's very clear is that Africa has continued to grow right since the start of this millennium. Since 2000, Africa has consistently grown year on year. Through the financial crisis, Africa, unlike any other part of the world, did not have any single quarter of contraction. And just going forward, the expectation is that Africa will continue to grow between 4 to 6%, depending on who you talk to, right through till 2014. So all of that continues to underpin the development and growth of the investment banking industry and investment flows into Africa.
So you see a direct correlation between GDP growth and foreign investment growth and investment banking growth?
All of these are linked together. Most certainly, all of them are linked together.
So on that note, then, let me ask you about some concerns that are in the market. There's been a report by the World Bank saying that emerging markets will lead the global recovery. However, there are some strong external shocks that still persist, namely the Eurozone debt crisis that we are still currently witnessing here in Europe. To what extent does this crisis in Europe undermine future growth in Africa next year?
It's fair to say that the economies of the world are all increasingly interlinked. Africa cannot be completely isolated from what is happening in the rest of the world, in particular also what's happening in the Eurozone. So to the extent that there is reduction in imports from the Eurozone, that's certainly going to have some impact on Africa. But just as important, one must recognize that there are some very fundamental secular shifts which are taking place in Africa. And that's going to be important in driving growth in Africa across the next few years.
What kind of shifts? I mean, I know we have been talking a lot about South-South investment. Is that what you're referring to, or do you mean more internal shifts within Africa itself?
It's a combination of things. I think the first thing that the first and obvious thing that everyone has pointed to is commodities in Africa. Africa has 9% of the world's oil, 60% of the world's diamonds, platinum, chrome, etc. But just as important is to look at certain other things happening in Africa. Africa is forecast to grow at around 5% per annum right through till 2014. What that means is that you're going to see an increase in consumer spending in Africa of around 30% across this period. Now just look at this in terms of certain things, certain important industries and certain things. You just pick up the telecom industry, for example. Africa added 90 million subscribers last year. 90 million subscribers is the total population of Germany. And still Africa has only 4 out of 10 people connected by mobile phone. Across the next few years, right again through to 2015, the expectation is that Africa is going to add 350 million mobile subscribers. That's equal to the entire population of the United States.
Staggering figure, absolutely, yeah.
Staggering.
So what you're saying basically is that these new consumer classes are driving a lot of the growth, and they're driving domestic demand, so people aren't just relying on, or countries rather, are not simply relying on exporting their own commodities, but they're actually also relying on manufacturing things for their own population.
Absolutely so. I think that's very well put. You just pick up, we spoke of the telecom industry, but you know, that same theme would be replicated across many sectors. With the growth in per capita income, what you're also seeing is people who are at the very bottom of the pyramid moving higher up in that pyramid.
Social mobility.
The social mobility.
Right.
And it's the kinds of things that they start to consume which is changing. Also higher disposable income, having just a magnifying flow right through the rest of the economy.
So let me ask you then, on that note, we've already identified this one trend that we're moving away from specifically commodity-related sector investment to more consumer-based sectors. What are some of the other trends that you can tell us about that we could see next year as far as investment in Africa goes?
I think there are a number of interesting sectors. Commodities spoken of, telecom we spoke of. Take banking. 80% of Africa still does not have access to bank accounts. The banking industry, the growth of financial services in Africa, that's going to be an important trend which plays out across the next few years. So also infrastructure spending. You're going to see huge investment in certain countries in power projects, in roads, in just developing port infrastructure, all of these things. Agriculture. Africa has 25% of the world's arable land, yet produces only 10% of the agricultural output. You're going to start seeing things like increase in consumption of fertilizers, increase in consumption of high-yielding special kinds of seeds. All of these kinds of things are also going to simply start flowing through the African economy.
Interesting. So banking and agribusiness, two other sectors to highlight. Finally, before you go, I just want to ask you about the way that Africa is perceived by investors around the world. A lot of people, and I think you may have alluded to it in your first answer, is that Africa is seen as the final frontier in a way. And I just wanted to ask you about that, because is that a slightly outdated perception now? Should we still really be calling Africa the final frontier? I mean, isn't that really just something that's no longer relevant?
It's very easy to always paint in broad brushstrokes, but the reality is that Africa has more than 50 countries. Across Africa, different countries are in different stages of their evolution. You have countries like South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria have all become significant players and are major emerging, if not emerged economies. But you also have many economies which have still a long way to go. So I think it's difficult to paint in broad brushstrokes and say that Africa is the final frontier or not. But within Africa, there are some countries which are still to come onto the radar screen of the international investor community.